know, hiring feminists to be your counselors, therapists, clinicians, that's like inviting your enemy in war to come into your primary headquarters and set up your battle plan. Shit. What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black masculinist news for the day. Hope everybody is well out there. Still trying to get back on schedule, so I'm working on it. Today we're going to review a video I ran across. Somebody sent me on Twitter, and apparently it's a TikTok of a woman who identifies herself as a clinician who has decided to give black men advice. This always goes well, so why don't we check out what she has to say.
Say you need to expand your emotional vocabulary. It's so your life can be easier. Don't you want to be able to communicate with your bitch? I think yes, right? Long gone are the days where you can just shut down. Bitches is not tolerating that. Like, it used to be where men provided financially or with schmeat, and bitches can make their own self come and we can pay for our own shit. So I'm gonna need y'all to catch up on the emotional part. If a bitch is telling you, I need you to communicate more, open your fucking mouth. But you know what I realized? And let me back up. A common misconception about me as a clinician is that 90% of my clientele have been men. Black men specifically. And what we specifically work on is expanding their emotional vocabulary, because a lot of y'all motherfuckers don't even have the words to express how you're feeling. So when you expand your vocabulary and knowledge of what you are experiencing, because y'all are human beings who experience feelings and emotions and don't have to choke that shit down no more. Y'all ain't had to choke that shit down since 2016. Anyway, if y'all are not in therapy, expanding your emotional vocabulary, your life just off top is going to be more difficult. When you expand your emotional vocabulary, you expand your awareness of yourself. When you expand your emotional vocabulary, you understand how you can navigate in this bitch. This fucking weird ass world that is so hard on y'all. Like, let's acknowledge that the world is very difficult for y'all, but y'all are not making it any easier, bruh. You're not. When bitches are telling y'all to go to therapy, it's not for us, it's for y'all sad motherfuckers. Go to therapy, talk about that shit that's on your chest. You don't have to choke that shit down no more. Y'all are doing a disservice to yourself. And so let me sum this shit up. Y'all told bitches to elevate our standards. And at the cost of us elevating y'all standards, y'all got axed because y'all didn't elevate either. Bitches are not tolerating emotional abuse, emotional neglect. Step it up. Go talk to somebody. Go expand your emotional vocabulary so your life can be better, bitch. All right. Go in peace.
That wasn't the most pathetic bullshit. Anyway, there's so much to unpack in that. You know, but let's be clear. First and foremost, when we talking about psychology as a field, when we're talking about this whole question of what role gender and race plays in it, and the perception of black men, I don't want y'all to get this shit twisted. So much of it is laced with misandry, laced with this superiority complex. I mean, one of the things I immediately said after this, and I posted it on Facebook, I said everything here, from the patronizing hostility to the catch-up rhetoric or the come listen rhetoric, you know, to the interpretation of emotional intelligence, which is really just rooted in a women's, a definition that hails from a women's space, right? So in other words, they're holding us to a standard that they've defined for themselves. and they've measured our emotional intelligence based on how well we adopt and adapt to a language that they've constructed. A language that doesn't really work for men. And part of the reason so many men are quiet is because we've tried emotionally expressing ourselves with women. It does not generally go well. Women tend to punish you for it. It's not an accident. People's responses to behavior are not, arbitrary. They come out of something. Many men talk to each other about this, and they've come to the conclusion that when it comes to emotional expression, it's best to do that with your boys. Or, maybe with a therapist, but we're going to talk about why we need to be careful about that too. But doing so with women can have long-term repercussions on the relationship that aren't always good. Many a woman has come forward in social media and reported on how much respect she's lost for the man in her life because he emotionally expressed himself the way women told men to do. So when men actually begin to pull back, now you got people like this who come out and want to, pathologize black men as, these unemotional creatures. And the only men she mentioned that could be good, right, were her clients. And that was it. But apparently we told women to elevate and they elevated, and now we don't qualify. This superiority narcissistic bullshit is ridiculous, especially when it comes from trained professionals, right? So I said emotional intelligence, in terms of how women have defined it, is the measure of how they judge our expression, right? And in essence, all it's going to do in the long run is repel men. The truth is, men are expanding what emotional intelligence is because the category has been treated as a female-defined space for too long. And when men tried using the feminine gestures of emotional intelligence, they were often disrespected by the very women that demanded it. Now men are starting to create a language for what they need in order to express it and not allow women to either shame them or define the form of their emotional expression. In other words, men are creating their own ways of emoting and articulating, and it's not being superseen or judged by women. For black men in particular, this is uniquely revolutionary because it means that you're actually constructing how you position yourself as a human being, how you've composed yourself, and how you articulate. And you're not allowing anyone to shame you into doing it the way they want you to do it. Because that's what the low-key shaming is about, even in this video. She's pressuring you and shaming you into emotional expression, but only emotional expression as she defines it, which is in many ways shaped by feminism. Black feminism in particular, but nonetheless, not anything that actually takes your humanity into account. That's part of what we're dealing with here. So one of the concepts I've talked about in the last years, one I called men's relationship emotional labor. And I brought that up and created it because I began to notice that men are generally considered, as far as relationships go, to basically do nothing. That's the ongoing stereotype. That men do nothing, women do all the emotional work, and if anything, men exploit women on their emotional work. And what I began to discover, having had, marriage and several significant relationships even in my own life, is that men do a lot of untold emotional labor that nobody credits them for, but they are measured by how well they do it and can be fired in a relationship if they don't do it at all. As a matter of fact, I've argued that it is probably the most important thing that women judge men against, even though they never tell us that. We're not raised to believe it. We're expected to perform it, punished if we don't do it well, and our reward for doing it well, she holds on to you and possessively doesn't let anyone get to you if that's on her agenda. But the point is, we provide all kinds of emotional labor work in a lot of different ways. And today we're going to talk about a couple, but before I get to that, I want to actually talk about some of these clinicians real quick. And I'm going to pull from Tommy Curry's The Man Not. And one of the things he talks about is the Duluth model. So we're going to look at an example of what I mean when I say that misandry, most particularly anti-black misandry, is entrenched in certain fields, right? And so as it pertains to the Duluth model, let's see here. One of the things he talks about, and this is page 118, he says, according to Pence, the Duluth model was never meant to explain the actual cases or circumstances of domestic violence. It was about imposing the ideological stance of the model and its staff, And that meant ignoring violence between same-sex couples and violence committed by women against men. Cases of domestic abuse that did not fit their theory were simply dismissed as irrelevant to the ideological commitments of the Duluth Project. Pence explains, it was the cases themselves that created the chink in each of our theoretical suits of armor. Speaking for myself, I found that many of the men I interviewed did not seem to articulate a desire for power over their partner, although I relentlessly took every opportunity to point out to men in the groups that they were so motivated and merely in denial. Although I relentlessly took every opportunity to point out to men in the groups that they were so motivated and merely in denial. The fact that few men ever articulated such a desire went unnoticed by me and many of my coworkers. Eventually, we realized that we were finding what we had already predetermined to find. The DAIP staff were interpreting what men seemed to expect or feel entitled to as a desire. When we had to start explaining women's violence toward their partners, lesbian violence, and the violence of men who did not like what they were doing, we were brought back to our original undeveloped thinking that the violence is rooted in how social relationships, e.g. marriage, and the rights people feel entitled to within them are socially, not privately constructed. Now back up a bit and talk, very briefly about the Duluth model itself. In education groups for men who batter the Duluth model, Ellen Pence and Michael Pamar, the inventors of the model, argue that treating men who batter their partners is not a neutral endeavor. In the Duluth program, each facilitator conducts a group within a community, a program, and a personal philosophical framework that either supports a man's process of change toward nonviolence or reinforces his dominance over the woman he batters. Theory guides practice here, say Pence and Pamar, and their theory is simple. Men are culturally prepared for their role of master of the home, even though they must enforce the right to exercise this role. They are socialized to be dominant and women to be submissive. The Duluth model holds that men need not intend to batter women. It is automatic, almost unconscious. It is an automatic, almost unconscious response, part of the programming men are taught in their families of origins and their experiences in a culture that teaches men to dominate. So the idea of the Duluth model was predetermined, and it was rooted in a feminist narrative that framed men as oppressors and those who have been socialized to be oppressors. This language has been so deeply entrenched in popular culture and even in various forms of psychology that it's treated as a social truth without any evidence to back it up. And they've applied this model all over the world without actually assessing men's behavior or its motivations. They predetermined it and assumed it and applied it, transposed it onto men, imposed it in many ways. And that's what I'm seeing here. I'm seeing with this particular woman who identifies herself as a clinician, I'm seeing the imposition of feminist ideas on her very interpretation of Black men, not even allowing for our humanity. But let's get back to men's relationship, emotional labor. One of the things I talked about before is, again, a type of emotional labor that men perform for women that goes unregarded, even though it is sought after and men's value in relationships is measured by it. And I'm gonna give you two examples, of this kind of men's relationship emotional labor, and it's being gaslit when we're told that there's, we don't do any, but we're still measured by it. So the first one, for example, would be something comedian Patrice O'Neal referred to as downloading, right? You ever notice, fellas, how often your girl wants to talk, but she doesn't really want to talk? It's not a back and forth. As a matter of fact, if you don't say anything, some women will go ahead and talk for hours. And it seems like a preoccupation on a regular basis that they have to just talk for hours. And they even stop caring if you're listening. They want you near, but they're not actually asking for feedback. They just have this need to download into you. Well, guess what? That's a form of men's relationship emotional labor. You ever not talk to her for a period of time and watch how she behaves when you start to again, and how much she seems to need to be able to do it? Many men report this to me on a regular basis, and I've sat in with BGS and listened to a number of different shows on YouTube and listened to men talk about this incessant need to be talked at, where you may not even be in the room as far as they're concerned. I mean, even when I was younger, I used to know brothers that would put the phone down and walk out the room, and she'd still be talking when they came back to it later because he was almost irrelevant. His presence was needed. But other than that, now if he was an active and good listener, by further participating, it made her feel even better. But at the end of the day, many men report having to even force themselves into the conversation just so it can have some back and forth. That is a form of emotional labor that is thrust upon you, socially expected of you, and is part of your measurement as a good man, whether or not you're capable of listening, right? And playing that role in a relationship. And I want to hear men in the comment section talk to me about your experiences with this dynamic. Have you experienced women downloading into you? Has it been treated as an expectation in relationships, whether you've said you would or not? And how far have you seen it pushed? How far have you experienced it being pushed? But little things like if you can bring up fine points later on, if you can find new ways to support her based on things she said. We're urged by psychologists and relationship counselors to do this kind of thing on a regular basis. How often or do we hear women urged to actually listen to the men they say they're with? See, one of the things we're told is men don't talk enough, but nobody ever questions whether women listen enough. The narrative, especially in terms of relationship counselors and therapists, has always been framed as men need to be supportive and listen. Women are not told to do that. And I think partly what it's done is create an entitlement in this regard, where women feel comfortable extending longer and longer periods of time where they talk, and the social expectation is that you listen and won't even ask you questions. I've kind of informally measured this when I've met new women, off a dating app or something, and we have our conversations. 70% of the time they talk. Very rarely have I found women actually asking you questions. A lot of the time it's them talking and then you interjecting to say something about your own experience, and then they go right back to talking. See, this is a form of emotional labor that men perform, listening. And it is societally kind of imposed. It is kind of pressured, and we're told that that's a standard. A second one, and this is a little different, is what I call finding her kink. The social expectation for men, especially when we have this idea that, we're supposed to, how do I put this? In relationships, it is kind of expected that you figure out sexually what she's into. She doesn't want to tell you, you have to figure it out. And again, part of your value is measured against whether or not you can do this. And if you can't do it, you might be left. We haven't even gotten into the act of sex. We're talking about figuring out what stimulates her. And the onus is on you to figure it out. Women don't have this task necessarily. Women are socialized to believe that men don't need anything more than a wet hole, and thus you have the privilege of entering her at her whim. But you have to do more than just offer penis. You actually have to seduce her. You actually have to figure out what she's interested in, what she's inspired by, what turns her on, no matter how freaky or crazy it is. And the difficult part about it is, if you go too far, the problem is yours. If you hit it on the mark, you'll not talk about it anywhere else, right? In other words, if you find her kink, you don't necessarily explore it, you don't necessarily talk about it, but you get credit for having found it. And if you didn't find it, the onus is on you. But the work of figuring it out and motivating her to express herself sexually in ways that she may not be able to do with anyone else or anywhere else is part of your work. And I'm not saying that either downloading or finding her kink is good or bad. I'm simply saying it is an expectation of men that does not get publicly discussed. Men's value is measured against how well we do it, and we're punished if we don't do it well, right? So finding her kink has to do everything with figuring her out sexually, even in ways that she may not have figured herself out yet. And your value is determined based on how well you do it. Another form of emotional labor that men perform for women, whether they're publicly or privately acknowledged for it or not. The acknowledgement is really kind of in the grade you get as to whether or not you're a quote unquote good man or not. You might be talked about negatively for not figuring that out, and you might be applauded for having figured it out. But either way, the onus often falls on you. And the interesting dynamic that comes with that is women don't actually believe men have a mental dimension to their sex, to their intimacy. They just believe, yet again, what they've been told. They have vagina, men want it. That's really all they need to do. Maybe a few tricks, oral here, there, but that's really about it. Men don't really need much. And many men have convinced themselves that as well. But one of the things I've heard men talk about most, and these often are brothers who identify themselves as SYSBM, and they've gone outside the country and, this kind of thing. One of the things I've heard most consistently from black men who practice this is that sex growing up, and particular to the United States, particular to the black community, was always about her pleasure. Your value as a man was determined based on how well you pleased her. How not only did you figure out her kink, but of course, the second part of that is performing, right? And so many men have reported that the sex act is all about pleasing her. Even in, from high school on, I've heard men talking about this kind of starfish dynamic where a woman will just lay there and expect you to perform. And we have, in many ways, adapted to this model and measured our sexual prowess and the degree to which we experience sexual pleasure based on how much she is pleasured. Some of these brothers who have broken away from that and started to date internationally have talked about how they've kind of left that dynamic alone and allowed themselves to experience pleasure rather than defining sex simply as something that pleases her. I think you'd be surprised how many men have this experience, even though it's not something we publicly talk about, and it's definitely not something you see in movies or television shows. But even in the era I came up in the 80s, we were told in many ways through the music, through the videos, the movies, the conversation around seduction and love was all about, when it came to sex anyway, how well you pleased her, how many hours you performed for, and whether or not you were physically pleasing, and all the aesthetics of your body were up to snuff, all these kind of things. But it was never about men's pleasure. Our pleasure was supposed to be gotten from how well we pleasured her, and the conversation she had with other women was always suited around, obviously, how well you did. But when men started talking about going elsewhere and redefining how they actually even engage sexual pleasure, they started to also talk about breaking from this kind of social idea that sex, as we understand it, was just about her pleasure. And the idea was you were supposed to get pleasure as a man simply because you had sex. That was the thing. She didn't necessarily have to do very much, but you had to figure out all kinds of other dimensions. You had to figure out, had to maintain some stamina. You had to do this, you had to do that. But it was all about her pleasure. And we told ourselves as men that our value, how well we did interacting with her, or even during the sex act, was again about pleasing her. So now I have brothers in their 50s and their 60s that are having sex for the first time in their lives, where they are not prioritizing her pleasure. They're actually just experiencing something with a person, and they're mutually exchanging pleasure. And that doesn't sound like much of a shift, but when you talk to these brothers, it is a world game changer. That the pressure on them is not all about pleasing her, or being in situations where they've been denied sex for so long that yes, the act of just having it is a release, but again, the goodness of it, or how good he is, still depends on what he does that she likes. See, these are the kind of conversations that men are having amongst themselves, most particularly mature men who've had 20 or 30 years of being married or being in conventional relationships where these things were not discussed. It was just expected of them. So when I talk about downloading, when I talk about finding her kink, or when I talk about the sex act itself, I want fellas to think about the various types of male relationship emotional labor you have provided to make her feel safe, to make her feel pleasured, to make her feel prioritized, all of these kinds of unspoken gifts that men extend and are measured by. Even though nobody taught us how, nobody taught us we would be, and it's constantly expected of us. Let me know your thoughts, fellas. Look forward to hearing it. Peace.